Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Talk of the Class podcast. I am Bryce Brown, your host and your guide on this education journey as we set out to discuss those challenges and issues facing K-12 public education and school teachers across the country. For more information about my background or what you might be able to expect from this podcast, be sure to go back and check out episode 1 from last week. It'll give you a lot more insight into where I'm coming from as an educator and kind of what you can expect moving forward in the podcast. Today we're going to be looking at an area that is near and dear to my heart and served kind of as the pillar for most of my time in public education. Of course, I'm talking about special ed. I'll be touching on the misconceptions that are kind of associated with special education, some of those major challenges that are facing special education teachers and students and even special education parents. And then looking at some tools that might help us as we serve our special education population, whether you're teaching in a gen ed classroom or something like a resource class or as an inclusion teacher, anybody who's working with the under the umbrella of special education. Before we get started, I do want to remind everyone to make sure to follow our podcast at Talk of the Class Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Also, make sure that you check us out at talkoftheclass.com. That's where you'll find the blog. You'll be able to join our community and also connect with other listeners in the community through the forums and a variety of other different options. You can also support us, which we would greatly appreciate, for just $5 a month in our Patreon account. Not only would you be supporting the show, you'd also get access to our monthly newsletter, as well as some bonus content. And then you have the opportunity to actually support yourself a little in that role. Those of you that have kind of a side hustle through either like Teachers Pay Teachers or Etsy or something like that, our members of our Patreon community have the opportunity to share their link on my website so that we can funnel business your direction as well. Have teachers showing up to your Teachers Pay Teachers pages, your Etsy pages, so on and so forth. So if you want to subscribe there for $5 a month, you can hit patreon.com/Talk of the Class podcast and support our show. Once again, we thank you for the support and hope you enjoy the show. So special education is one of those topics that can be a little polarizing. I think there are some misconceptions with what special education is now. And a lot of those come from kind of where our own experience with special ed is. For many of our veteran teachers especially, they were likely teaching in a time when special education was its own separate entity. And if you were a gen ed teacher, you really didn't have a lot of experience on a day-to-day basis with students that were serviced under the special ed umbrella. They were kind of segregated. Special ed classrooms were separate from general education classrooms. SPED teachers taught special ed, gen ed teachers taught gen ed, and they kind of each did their own thing. There wasn't a lot of overlap. And therefore, because of that, the skill sets were very different. What you were doing in a gen ed classroom was in many ways very different than what you were doing in a special education classroom. That has changed in recent years. I've been in education for going on 14 years now. And even in my time, I've seen kind of a major shift in what the special education model looks like. And it's changed even more so from the time I was in school to where we're at now. There's more of an inclusive, kind of integrated model of special education now, where the lines have become a little bit more blurred, and teachers are asked to do things that maybe weren't in their bag of tricks, their toolkit previously. And so for some teachers, that is going to require a great deal of kind of learning on the job, seeking out new resources. For other teachers, it maybe serves as a catalyst to move in a different direction, because a lot of teachers have kind of gotten to a point where they've been doing it a certain way for a long time, and they're not really interested in learning a new set of standards. They're not wanting to completely change directions on how it is that they approach their classroom. And so, from my experience, I can tell you that there are some veteran teachers who have really dug in their heels and have kind of refused to adjust that approach, even though they've needed more of like a multi-tiered method of instruction so that they can serve all students. They're kind of a lot more used to most of their students being on the same level, requiring the same supports. And so some have not been as willing to budge as others. Now, that's not to say that that is the norm. I think that most teachers are nothing if not flexible. You have to be. This is an ever-changing profession. And so most teachers have really kind of dug deep and figured out what are areas that I need to work on. How can I best transition into what it means to be a gen ed teacher now, with that special education support kind of moving into my classroom, as opposed to being removed and separated, kind of that least restrictive environment model that's now in play. Sometimes that unwillingness to move isn't necessarily because they're being stubborn. Sometimes it's just they don't have the equipment. They don't have the skill set, because it is not an approach that they were taught. If you've worked on golf carts your entire life and someone brings in a motorcycle, even though a lot of the systems are very similar, you can't just be expected to pick this up in a day because, a mechanic's a mechanic and they can do whatever. And I think that's something that's been lost a little bit in this transition. Teachers aren't necessarily unwilling to move. They just need to know what it's going to take to provide the best support for these students that, may not have been in their classroom 10 years ago. And a lot of that's going to come with collaboration. A lot of it's going to come from special education departments really making sure that they're finding ways to provide the training and the resources and the professional development to get these teachers everything that they need to do the best job possible under this inclusion model, or whatever approach the district is adopting. As a special ed teacher, I didn't see the gen ed teachers that kind of weren't getting with the program. I didn't see it as a reason to be adversarial. I kind of saw it as my opportunity to build that rapport. Here's a skill set that I have. Here are tools that I have used to help me reach these students where they are. And if you're willing, I would love to sit down, because your students are my students. We are working together to provide these students with the best support possible. So if we're on the same page and we're working with the same bag of tricks, it's going to be better for the student overall. So I kind of saw it as an opportunity to form those relationships and kind of build a better understanding. And a lot of times what you'll learn, even if you're coming from the special ed side of things, is that gen ed teacher has some tricks of their own that are incredibly helpful. A lot of times you've already been doing a lot of the things that are really vital in that support of a special education student, you just didn't know that that's what you were calling it. So things like differentiation, good teachers are already doing that, right? Whether you're in a general ed classroom where you're having no students that fall under the special education or 504 umbrella, you're still differentiating because your students aren't all on the same level all the time. From one topic to the next, you're going to have students that, maybe they were really successful in the last chapter and now they're struggling. And so how do you meet them where they are? Those are things that veteran teachers have already been doing for a long time. They may just not have called it differentiation or scaffolding, things like that. It's the terminology might be different. The approach isn't necessarily different. So education's all about adapting. There's so many resources that are available now. And I think a lot of it is just making sure that your colleagues on the general education side of things have the resources they need to be able to support those students in every way possible. If you're a teacher that has found success in your approach to special education students, I think it's your duty as an educator to share those tools with your colleagues. If you find a website that is incredibly helpful, if you find maybe a workbook that you've been using with your students that you've seen a ton of growth, share that. Okay, this again, we're all part of the same team. The reason that great schools perform really well is because they're a cohesive unit. Everybody's working for the same purpose. Okay, it's not look how great my class is doing compared to your class. All right, that's not a sustainable approach to education. Because next semester you might have those kids that were struggling in the other class. You're going to wish that they had the resources that you had. So I think that you'll find that just by helping some of these teachers that may not have it in their toolkit, by helping them get started and figure out where to begin to seek out those resources, it can really go a long way toward bridging that gap between the gen ed side and the special ed side. So I had made mention of differentiation and scaffolding, and things like chunking, breaking down larger concepts into kind of manageable pieces that will ultimately be, pieced together to put together the whole idea. As I mentioned, this is something that's just good teaching practice. So whether you're teaching elementary school kids, whether you're teaching, gifted learners or, kids under the 504 or special ed umbrella, good teachers work with students where they are. And they're able to adapt the overall concept that they're teaching to the needs of the student. How can I get this information across to you where you are and build up to where we're supposed to be, rather than I'm giving it to you at this level, you either get it or you don't. It's, again, not a sustainable approach to just kind of beat your head against a wall by treating all students as if they all have the same skill set. Just like we as teachers don't all have the same skill set, our students certainly don't, and we have to adapt accordingly. That being said, the logistics of differentiating, especially with class sizes being what they are now, it can feel overwhelming. I know that when I was teaching middle school, I very regularly had 28 to 32 students in a class. To be able to break those large numbers down into manageable small groups based on ability levels and the needs of those individual students, it was a task and it took a lot of work. Fortunately, there are so many things now that are available, especially online, that can really help this task become a lot more manageable. And it's something that even, as I mentioned, 13, 14 years ago, when I got into education, these weren't tools that were, widely available. You can find a lot of web-based platforms now that are really structured in a way that you can still approach the overall concept, but assign key pieces to different groups, kind of to meet them where they are, as I said earlier. And then ultimately, each of those things are building up to where, hopefully, by the end of the lesson or the topic or the unit, your students are kind of, those gaps are closing quite a bit. Personally, for me, I taught middle school resource math and ELAR, and Khan Academy, KHAN. If you haven't used it, it was such a foundational piece of my differentiation in my classroom. As a resource teacher, so once I transitioned from teaching general education to teaching resource, my class sizes were no longer 30 to 32. It's not feasible when you're working with resource, but I would still often have double digits or right around it in my class. And when you're working with, students in a resource environment, you sometimes have students that are 3, 4, 5 or more years behind grade level in your content area. And when you're dealing with those kind of deficits at all different levels throughout your classroom, so say I had 10 students, I might have 1 or 2 students on a 3rd grade level, 1 or 2 students on a 4th grade level, so forth and so on, in an 8th grade classroom, right? There's not necessarily enough hours in the day for me to spend time every single day. Okay, I'm going to work with these 2, and then I'm going to work with these 2, and I'm going to work with these 2. So where Khan Academy came in handy is I could outline a concept that we were working on. So, for instance, in math, if we were dealing with adding and subtracting fractions, right? For some students, they were just needing maybe a little bit more of like a visual aid to help them understand what adding fractions looked like. For some of my students in my classroom, they didn't know how to add whole numbers without some pretty serious intervention sometimes. So to get these students to be able to add fractions, I first have to go back and kind of scaffold in that addition component, because I can't add pieces until I first know what adding even looks like. And so I could kind of teach an overarching concept and then assign individual lessons within Khan Academy at the level of the student I was working with, so that they were working on the same overarching concept, but at the level they needed, all working toward the same goal. And what Khan Academy did for me, not only did it provide supplemental support through video lessons and walkthroughs and the opportunity for trial and error, and they could get hints, and it would kind of walk them through each piece of the problem. But it also served as a wonderful data collector for me, so that at the end of a week or a lesson or a unit, I'm looking at growth. I'm looking at specific key skills within the overall unit that the students really struggled on, and then I could use that to kind of build my spiral reviews back in for the individual students in the classroom. So it wasn't about reinventing the wheel. It was about finding resources that could serve multiple purposes for me, to kind of help me overcome the logistical nightmare of teaching that many students at that many levels, within the already kind of breakneck pace of state standards. So going and talking to your special education department leaders, your coordinators, veteran special ed teachers on your campus, your curriculum and instruction staff, they can help you find these resources. Like I said, Khan Academy worked great for me because of the class size that I had and just kind of the way my schedule laid out. I was teaching 6 different grade levels, 6 different preps. So I had 6 through 11th grade. And by state standards in math, that was everything from, standard 6th grade math all the way up through Algebra 2 and algebraic reasoning. So the degree of difficulty of trying to bring students who are struggling with, basic multiplication and division, but have them with a working knowledge of algebraic concepts, I could not have done that without this type of resource, because it was, again, meeting them where they were, and allowing them to work through those processes with visual aids, with walkthroughs, and with hints along the way. And that doesn't mean that I let, Khan Academy teach the lessons for me. I let it be my guide as to where I needed to place my emphasis when it came time for that intensive kind of one-on-one reteach, and deeper connection with each individual student. So again, looking for resources. Let the internet be your friend. Let other teachers be your friend. Guys, lesson planning is about not reinventing the wheel. It's about finding what works for other teachers and stealing it. If teachers tell you that they create every aspect of every lesson they've ever done, they're either lying to you or they have way too much time on their hands. There are not enough hours in the day for you to try to, start from scratch on every single lesson. You're teaching the same concepts that other people are teaching. Find what works for you and use it. Okay? There is kind of moving on from the resource aspect. There is this misconception. So when I talked about the students that I was teaching in special education, especially those years in middle school resource, a lot of my students were at a pretty severe either reading deficit or math calculation deficit. And so there's this misconception that special education students, special education is synonymous with unintelligent. And as someone who has spent effectively his entire career working with this population, that could not be farther from the truth. In fact, some of my most gifted students that I've ever taught, who had just a wonderfully brilliant mind for certain aspects of their learning, fell under that special education umbrella. And so kind of changing this narrative of what special education means. I think when I was in school, and probably when a lot of us were in school, you don't know what you don't know. So if you weren't in special education classes and you were segregated from special education classes, you kind of create the narrative yourself of what that means. And once you get a chance to kind of see behind the curtain, you start to realize that it is such a broad spectrum of support services under the special education umbrella or title. And it does not mean that these students are less than in any way. I had students that had, really intense support needs from a reading standpoint, and it would manifest itself in math as well when it came to word problems and, trying to decipher what the question was asking. But if they were given a calculation problem, where you took the reading aspect out of it, I had absolutely math whiz level students who just struggled to read. They were not unintelligent. They could do math problems sometimes quicker than I could. Their specific learning need prohibited them from being able to, be highly effective in one area while being superb in another. And that's where this term that many people in and out of education may not have heard, is twice exceptional students who are showcasing a need in one area under the support services of special ed, while also exhibiting a very high level ability in another area. We see it a lot of times, especially, though not exclusively, with students that fall on the ASD spectrum, the autism spectrum disorder, where they might receive special education services for certain key pieces of their education, but they're also exhibiting incredible creativity and high level thinking that we are associating generally with our gifted education, our GT classes. And so until you've taught one of those students, or until you've kind of been made aware of the existence of these kind of dual coded students, you may not even know that they exist. Twice exceptional students also require differentiation, just like our gen ed students require, just like our special education supported students require. Our twice exceptional students are going to require differentiation because they're going to need the supports, but we also have to meet them where they are. They might require modifications to their assignments to not become overwhelmed by the volume of the workload. They might require a color coding system that helps them to focus on specific parts of the task at hand. But then they also might need more challenged, higher level critical thinking questions that you may not be asking of some of your other students. And so it really becomes important with these students, just as it is with any of our students, that we kind of pay close attention to what their skills are, what their areas of need are, but also, areas in which they excel. And we really try to focus their individualized instruction to kind of hone in on those skills. A great place for resources for this particular type of student can be found with the University of Connecticut. They have a program called the Gifted ASD Project. It can be found at giftedasd.project.uconn.edu. That is the University of Connecticut. They have a blog. They provide resources and strategies for addressing the needs of these students. I've taught a handful of students that were coded both ways, and it wasn't until later on that I found these resources, and once I did, it really helped me better understand how I can address the really specific needs of this type of student. So again, that is the University of Connecticut Gifted ASD Project, giftedasd.project.uconn.edu. Perhaps one of the sometimes scariest and sometimes most overwhelming aspects of being a special education teacher or being involved in special education in any way is that of the relationship between the special education educator and the parents of students that are serviced under special education. I can tell you with absolute certainty that I have been fortunate to have absolutely amazing relationships with students and their parents, parents who were incredibly grateful for the work that we were doing, for the extra attention to detail when it came to, really making sure that we were, meeting the needs of their student as an individual. But I've also been on the other side. I've been the teacher who's been part of a department that, for one reason or another, the parent, was not pleased with the work that we were doing. Oftentimes, when that is the case, there's this constant fear of legal action because, if you've had the privilege and joy of working in special education, you know that special education law is very detailed and very expansive, and sometimes nobody knows special ed law better than the parents of students who are receiving support services. So it's really important not only to establish good relationships with these parents, but also, make sure that you are covering your bases when it comes to special education law. You need to make sure that you are crossing your T's and dotting your I's and not cutting corners, because there are various aspects of special education where, things are very explicitly outlined on what the expectation is, and there's not really a lot of wiggle room. So you really have to be deliberate in your actions and making sure that you're following the letter of the law. But for whatever reason, there seems to be that kind of this common theme of almost an adversarial relationship at times, where there's a certain degree of like contentiousness and distrust between some parents, and I want to reiterate some, because overwhelmingly I have had positive experiences. But between some parents of these students that are receiving support services and then the special education department within the school district. And it really used to bother me early on in my career, because I think most teachers will tell you that they feel like they're going above and beyond for every student in their classroom. And I was no different. I felt like, why would my department be under attack if only they were in the school with us and they saw the links that we were going to make sure that their student was, given the absolute best support. It hurt my feelings. I felt like the parent thought that I did not care about their child. And like I said earlier, almost, probably 90% or more of the parents that I was able to work with over my time were incredibly supportive. And unfortunately, a lot of times those aren't the ones you remember. You really, you let it get stuck on you. The ones where, the parents were seemingly waging war against your department. And fortunately, I never had a parent that kind of focused their attention on me directly. But as a department, you do kind of have this protective family style feel, where we're all working together to support usually, the same group of students. A lot of times, a lot of my math students would also be, receiving ELAR supports. So, if you were coming after the special education coordinator, or you were coming after the English teacher when I was teaching math, or vice versa, we really took that personally. And I finally got to a point where I kind of took the personal feeling out of it, and I tried to kind of turn off my teacher brain and tried to look at it from the perspective of the parent or the family member. Now, I'm in a unique situation because of my own family experience. So I know there are a lot of people that work in special education that maybe did not have any ties to students that received any kind of support until they were working in special education. But for me personally, my younger brother has cerebral palsy. And because of that, I have a lot of experience with what it's like to feel like nobody understands your specific situation. So for us, when I was growing up, we did not make any decisions as a family without considering the impact that his condition would have on those decisions that we were making. So, my parents' purchase of a vehicle, or if we were going on any kind of family trip, or even something as simple as like going shopping for school clothes, right? A trip to the mall. We had to think about the overall plan. We had to be very strategic in how we were planning these things, because we needed to look at, is the vehicle accessible? Is the place that we're going to shop going to be accessible? For a period of time, he was on a four-wheeled walker. He spent a fair amount of time in a wheelchair. He spent most of his life on crutches. And so accessibility is a big thing. He also dealt with a great deal of discomfort. By the time he was 17 years old, I think he had had 6 or 7 major surgeries. He had had his legs broken, his hips broken, his pelvis, all kinds of things, screws put into him, metal plates to try to secure his legs in position. The type of seat in the vehicle, the amount of time he would need to be standing up, or the distance that we would have to walk. These were all things that we had to think about that, the average family isn't necessarily having to, go through the hassle of dealing with just to make a trip to the mall to buy school clothes. And so when you live your life like that, it kind of becomes second nature to you. But you have a hard time trusting that anyone else can put themselves in your shoes. Like, you don't understand because you don't live it, right? And you almost forget that empathy exists, right? Like, just because someone hasn't lived your exact situation doesn't mean that they're not, feeling for you and willing to go to the ends of the earth to make sure that you have everything that you say you need, to be in the best position for success. It was really hard for us to assume that anyone would take that same degree of planning when it came to his care. So a lot of times we just did things ourselves, to the point where we probably did sometimes too much for him, because it was easier for us to just do it than to hope that he could do it himself, and something bad happened because we were unwilling to. So we also knew we were responsible for him and that he had our undivided attention. He was one person. He was the one person in our family that needed that attention, and so he got it from us, right? But when we're talking about a school district, you have a lot of students. So as a parent or a family member, I'm looking at your classroom and going, well, how is my kid going to get your undivided attention if you've got 10 other kids in that same class with him. They all need attention, and you can't possibly be willing to put my kids' needs above everyone else's. And so out of that fear, out of that distrust, comes this me versus you sort of relationship. And once I looked at it from that angle, I stopped taking it so personally. And I started really focusing on how can I open that line of communication, build that rapport with that family member to let them know I'm never going to be able to do for your student what you're able to do for your student. You're right. There is one of them and one of you, and there is one of me and 10 of them. But what I can promise you is I will do everything I am able to do to provide the absolute best environment and best situation for your kid. And I think by beginning to break down those walls, there begins to be a little more trust. And trust is something that's earned, right? Like we don't just walk into any relationship automatically trusting someone. I'm not going to hand my baby over to a stranger, right? So then when you add the additional layer of the special considerations that have to be taken for a student, with various needs, that trust has to be earned. Another big thing that I think is incredibly important is that you need to be incredibly honest. Something that happens not just in special education, but I think in education in general, is that we often oversell what we're able to accomplish for a student, because we want to appease parents. We want everyone to be happy, right? So we talk about the things that we're going to accomplish as if we're going to move mountains, right? And I think it's really important that you are realistic with what you're going to be able to accomplish. Chances are, if they're coming into the relationship and they seem to be agitated at the thought of even having to deal with the special education department, it's probably due to something that's happened with them in the past. They've felt let down by a previous special education teacher or a department or a school district, or something has happened, right? These things, they don't happen in a vacuum, right? So you can begin to set yourself apart, I think, by helping them understand what you have the authority and the resources to accomplish with their child, without making promises that you have neither the intention or the ability to keep, right? Like I'm not going to tell you something just because you want to hear it. Here are the things that I have accomplished with students in the past, and here are the things that I'm going to try to accomplish with your student. Here are the resources that I have available and how I approach this particular need and how I've been able to approach this particular need in the past. I'm not going to say that by the end of the school year, your student is going to pass all of their standardized tests and you're not going to recognize them because their grades are going to be off the charts. Like that's not something that I have the ability to promise, because there are way too many extenuating circumstances for me to be able to kind of adhere to that plan, right? I'm going to do everything in my power based on the skill set that I have and the resources I have available. And then if your student also brings their A game and we meet each other in the middle and we're working hard together, I think great things will happen. And I think when you're realistic like that, you're keeping the expectations achievable, and you're not setting them up for failure. When you make promises that you can't keep, ultimately you're going to let them down, and then all you're doing at that point is reinforcing the distrust that they had in the first place. You told them you were going to do something and you didn't do it. Of course, that's their experience in the past. You're all the same, right? And that's what you don't want. Am I saying this is going to work for all parents? Like, oh, if you just communicate and you tell them the truth, everything will be gravy and life will be good and you're going to get an invitation to their birthday party and they're going to love you forever. No, right? There are some parents that no matter what you do, just like there are some teachers that no matter what you do, some people just like to watch the world burn, right? Like some people aren't happy unless they have a reason to feel slighted by someone else. There's not a lot you're going to be able to do for those people. But you can't assume that every parent that has a problem is being irrational or unreasonable. They probably feel the way they feel for a reason, and it's your job to help alleviate those concerns with the work that you're putting in and the care that you're showing their child. And that kind of brings me to my last point here. Part of truly caring for their child is treating their child like an individual. Accommodations, modifications, goals, objectives, they have a purpose. They are not a one-size-fits-all approach to education. I have unfortunately been in situations before where the same 6 or 7 accommodations were recommended for essentially every student that came through for an art committee meeting. And that is not only unfair to the kid, it's doing a disservice to the process of special education support as a whole. These things were created because they work. Accommodations were created because these students need these supports in order to close the gaps. And if you're not individually assigning accommodations based on the specific needs of that student, you're not helping that student. And ultimately, you're not helping yourself because you're going to not show any growth. You're going to look like you don't know what you're doing. Parents are going to wonder why their student is not gaining academically. And you're not going to be able to pinpoint what the key issue is because you're using a tool that shouldn't have been used in the first place, right? You don't use a hammer to dig a hole, right? Accommodations each have their own particular purpose. And that even means that two students with the same, roughly the same need might need two different accommodations because what works for one may not work for the other. So you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to try and then take a look at what's happening and say, you know what, this is just not working for this student. Let's come back together as a committee and let's see if we have additional ideas that may be more effective for this student. Does that mean more meetings? Yes. Do we have time for more meetings? No. But it's the job. And if you're just kind of randomly assigning accommodations to feel like you're doing something, to check a box off in that ARD process, you're doing it wrong. And I get it. It's time consuming and it's tedious to kind of go over the needs of each individual student with a fine-tooth comb and try to figure out what is most suitable for their specific skill set. But if we're truly in it to help students grow and to have them leave our class in a better place than they arrived, then those are the extra tasks that we have to take on. I can't overstate the importance of taking that time to provide that input. Whether you're a special ed teacher or a gen ed teacher that is actually actively on that student's ARD committee, or you're just being asked as their general education math teacher to provide teacher input. What are you seeing in your classroom? What are things that they're doing well? What are areas that they need to grow? Those pieces of information are vital in that process of assigning those accommodations and setting the goals. If we don't know where the student is struggling, I don't know what goals I need to be trying to hit. And I think, again, because I've been on the gen ed side of it, and you get a teacher input form put in your box, and you're thinking, great, another piece of paper I have to fill out, another email I have to respond to, whatever it is, whatever your district's approach to getting teacher feedback. But 5 minutes of feedback now versus that banging your head against a wall that I was talking about earlier. Because if you're doing the same things over and over and over again without making any progress, that's far more frustrating than taking the 5 minutes to try to pinpoint the needs of the student. It's kind of a small ask to potentially achieve a big ultimate goal. So it'll help us better address the student individually. It'll help us pinpoint the approaches. It'll help us, if a student's coming in with their previous year's accommodations in place from last year's ARD, and in your class they're showing that they're still struggling with the same, specific things, that lets us know that maybe this accommodation isn't working. And without your feedback, we wouldn't know that. So that's, again, it's all part of a process, and the process as a whole is incredibly important, and it can't be done without each person doing their part along the way. So, again, these are not an exhaustive list of issues in special education. I also don't claim to be the world's resident expert on special ed and best practices. I speak from my experiences, and everyone has their own experience. We've all taught different students. We've all worked with different colleagues. We've all had the opportunity to learn from different mentors. And so we kind of all come into it with our own bag of tricks. And what might be a struggle for me might be an area of strength for you. And I think that's the importance of building these communities like we're trying to do with the podcast and the website here, is it gives an opportunity for us to come together and talk to each other as educators and try to develop things that will work for us individually. Just like we do a little trial and error with, the students with their accommodations, we can get information from each other and try to implement new things in our classroom, and it may work and it may not. And if it doesn't, then we come back to the drawing board as a community and we see if we can get insight from another teacher or another source. We don't survive without each other in education. So please feel free to share your thoughts and feedback with the community in the episode forum of the website. That is www.talkoftheclass.com/forum. Each individual episode has its own forum section, its own post where you can respond and ask questions and make comments. And you're not going to hurt my feelings if you're like, this guy sounds like he doesn't know what he's talking about, or who decided to give this guy a podcast. You're not going to hurt my feelings. And the answer is, I did. I decided to give me a podcast, and I promise I'll get better as it goes on. Don't forget to follow the social media channels. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube for the video version of the podcast. If you're someone who prefers to watch rather than listen, then each individual episode will be up each week on YouTube. Thank you again so much for your support. As always, feel free to reach out to me at talkoftheclasspodcast@gmail.com with topic suggestions, guest suggestions. If you're somebody that has a unique experience, or you're working with an organization that you feel like getting your message out would be really important, or you just know somebody that you think would be an excellent guest for the show, I am happy to listen to all of those suggestions. Again, that's talkoftheclasspodcast@gmail.com. Again, I appreciate everyone and hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you again next week on next week's episode.